The bank robber's horse returned home without its rider and led the posse to a cabin full of hungry children. The sun came up hard and pale that morning, like it always did in October. Thomas Kane stood in the shadows beside the First National Bank of Millfield, watching the light creep across the empty street. His hands were steady on the reins, but inside his chest, something was breaking apart like old wood. 3 months. 3 months since he'd found work. 3 months since Mary had asked him why her stomach hurt all the time. 3 months since he'd looked into Samuel's eyes and seen a grown man's worry in a 14-year-old boy's face. Ember shifted beneath him, her breath making small clouds in the cold air. She was a good horse, better than he deserved. Her coat was the color of dying embers, dark red with streaks of gold that caught the light when she moved. He'd raised her from a foal, and she knew his moods better than most people knew their own wives. Kane pulled his hat down low and touched the gun at his side. The metal was cold through his glove. He'd never drawn it on another man before. Never wanted to, but one didn't fill empty bellies or keep the fever away from little ones who coughed in the night. The bank door opened, and Mr. Peterson walked out, same as he did every morning at 8:30. Kane waited 5 more minutes, the way he'd planned. 5 minutes for Peterson to get far enough down the street. 5 minutes to think about what came next. He thought about Mary's face when he'd given her the last apple 2 days ago. How she'd broken it into 4 pieces, one for each of her brothers, keeping the smallest piece for herself. She was only 6 years old, but hunger had made her wise in ways that hurt to watch. Kane dismounted and tied Ember to the post outside the bank. She looked at him with those dark eyes that seemed to know too much. He touched her neck, feeling the warmth of her through his gloves. "Wait for me, girl," he whispered. The bell above the door rang when he walked in. The sound was bright and cheerful, like nothing bad could ever happen in a place that announced visitors with such a pretty sound. Behind the counter, young Jimmy Carlisle was counting money, his fingers moving through the bills like he was playing piano. He looked up when Kane approached, and his smile died when he saw the gun. "Don't make me use this," Kane said, and his voice was quiet as falling leaves. Jimmy's hands shook as he raised them. He was maybe 20 years old, with soft hands and eyes that had never seen real trouble. His father owned the bank, owned half the town, owned things that other people could only dream about touching. "Please, Mr. Kane," Jimmy said, and Kane was surprised the boy knew his name. "You don't want to do this." "No," Kane agreed, keeping the gun steady. "I surely don't." But wanting had nothing to do with it. Wanting was a luxury for people who had choices. Kane put all the money from the drawer into a canvas bag, moving slow and careful. His hands didn't shake anymore. When a man had nothing left to lose, steadiness came easy. Outside, Ember was waiting, patient as stone. Kane could hear voices down the street, people starting their day, going about their business like the world wasn't breaking apart one family at a time. He thought about Martha Kane, buried in the cold ground behind the little church. She made him promise to take care of their babies. Made him swear on her mother's Bible that he wouldn't let them go hungry. He was keeping that promise the only way he knew how. Kane put his foot in the stirrup and swung up on Ember's back. The bag of money felt heavier than it should have, like it was full of stones instead of paper. Behind him, he could hear Jimmy Carlisle shouting for help, his young voice cracking like ice in spring. Ember knew what to do without being told. She'd always been smart that way. Her hooves beat a steady rhythm on the hard-packed dirt as they rode out of town, past the church where Martha was sleeping, past the schoolhouse where his children should have been learning their letters instead of learning how to divide one biscuit 4 ways. The desert opened up in front of them, endless and empty under the pale sky. Kane had hidden out here before, when the sheriff came looking for men who couldn't pay their debts. He knew the caves and the water holes, knew which paths would hide their tracks and which ones would lead a posse in circles. But he also knew Sheriff Morrison was no fool. Dutch Morrison had been tracking men across this desert for 20 years. He'd find the trail eventually. They always did. Behind them, Millfield was waking up to news of the robbery. Kane could almost hear the church bell ringing, calling people together, calling them to anger. In an hour, maybe 2, there would be a posse. Good men with rifles and rope, riding fast horses and carrying justice like a burden they were proud to bear. Kane touched Ember's neck and felt her steady heartbeat through the reins. She was breathing hard, but not struggling. She would run all day if he asked her to. She would carry him to the ends of the earth and never ask why. 3 miles out of town, Kane heard the first gunshot. It came from behind them, sharp as breaking glass in the quiet air. Then another. Then voices calling his name across the emptiness, carrying on the wind like tumbleweeds. Ember's ears went flat against her head, but she didn't slow down. Horses knew about running from danger. It was born in them deeper than thought. The second bullet found Kane in the back, just below his left shoulder. He felt like a punch, hard and sudden. The third one knocked him sideways in the saddle. The fourth sent him to the ground, and the last thing he saw was Ember's legs dancing nervous steps around him, her eyes wide with something that looked almost human. Kane tried to sit up, but his body wouldn't listen anymore. The desert sand was warm against his cheek, and the sky above him was the color of old silver. Far away, he could hear the posse coming, their horses' hooves like distant thunder. "Ember," he whispered, and she came close, lowering her head so he could touch her one last time. "Go home, girl. Go home and tell them." But the words wouldn't come. Instead, he whispered the names of his children, one by one, like a prayer or a promise or an apology he could never make right. Mary, Samuel, John, little Thomas. Ember stood over him until his breathing stopped, and then she stood there longer, watching the sun climb higher in the empty sky. When the posse finally reached them, they found Kane's body already growing cold and a horse that wouldn't let anyone come near. She stood guard until Sheriff Morrison spoke to her gentle and low, the way a man talks to something wild that might bolt or might listen. Only then did she let them take Kane's body and tie it across a spare horse. But when they turned back toward town, Ember didn't follow. She stood in that empty place where Kane had fallen, watching the dust settle heavy around his blood, understanding something that no horse should have to know. The posse disappeared over the ridge, and Ember was alone with the silence and the endless desert and the weight of promises that only she remembered now. 3 days passed before Ember came back to Millfield. Sheriff Dutch Morrison was sitting on his porch, cleaning his rifle and thinking about the empty coffin they'd put in the ground next to Martha Kane. Empty because Thomas Kane's body had disappeared sometime in the night, taken by coyotes or worse. All they'd found were torn clothes and dark stains in the sand. Morrison had been sheriff for 18 years. He'd seen men die for gold, for land, for women, for pride. He'd seen good men do bad things and bad men pretend to be good. But something about Kane's death sat wrong in his stomach, like bad meat that wouldn't digest. The sound of hooves on the main street made him look up. At first, he thought it was just another horse, maybe Pete Jameson bringing his mare to the blacksmith. But this horse was walking different, walking like it carried a weight that wasn't there. It was Ember, Kane's horse. Her red coat was dusty and her head hung low, but she was walking straight down the middle of Main Street like she owned it. Her saddle was empty, the leather dark with stains that Morrison didn't want to think about too hard. "Well, I'll be damned," Morrison said, setting his rifle aside. Ember stopped in front of the jail, right where Kane used to tie her when he came to town looking for work. She stood there patient and still, like she was waiting for something. Or someone. Morrison walked down the steps, slow and easy. Horses could be unpredictable when they'd been running wild, especially horses that had seen their riders die. But Ember just watched him with those dark eyes, calm as deep water. "Hey there, girl," Morrison said, reaching out to touch her neck. "Where you been?" Ember turned her head toward the desert, then back to Morrison. She did it again, more deliberate this time, like she was trying to tell him something. "Tom Briggs," Morrison called to his deputy, who was sweeping the jail steps. "Get Jake and Charlie. Tell them to saddle up. We going after Kane's gold?" Briggs asked, his young face eager. Morrison looked at Ember, at the way she kept turning toward the wasteland beyond town. Maybe, or maybe something else entirely. Within an hour, Morrison and 3 men were following Ember out of Millfield. The horse didn't need a rope or a lead. She just started walking, and they followed. Morrison had seen tracking dogs work like this, following scents that human noses couldn't catch. But this felt different. This felt like purpose. Ember led them through Miller's Canyon, past the old water hole where Apache used to camp. She took them down paths Morrison had never seen before, winding between red rocks and thorny bushes that scraped at their legs. The sun climbed higher, and the men started to mutter about water and shade and wild goose chases. "Sheriff," Jake Reeves said, wiping sweat from his forehead, "this horse could be leading us anywhere. Could be leading us to nothing. Could be," Morrison agreed. But he kept following. They rode for 3 hours, deeper in a country that didn't have names. Country where the rocks stood up like broken teeth and the wind made sounds like crying. Morrison had chased outlaws through most of this desert, but Ember was taking them places he'd never been. Finally, she stopped at the top of a ridge and looked down into a narrow valley. Morrison rode up beside her and saw what she was seeing. A cabin sat in the shade of 3 cottonwood trees, small and weathered and leaning slightly to one side. Smoke was coming from the chimney, thin and gray against the blue sky. It looked like the kind of place a man might go to hide from the world, or from himself. "That's got to be it," Charlie Morgan said, his hand moving to his gun. "Kane's hideout." Morrison held up a hand for quiet. Something was moving in the yard beside the cabin. Small figures, too small to be men. As they rode closer, Morrison could see what they were. Children. 4 of them. They were sitting around a wooden table in the shade of the trees, but the table was empty. The oldest was a boy, maybe 14, with Kane's dark hair and serious eyes. 2 younger boys sat beside him, 8 and 10 years old by Morrison's guess. And at the end of the table, a little girl with yellow hair and a dress that had been mended so many times it was more patches than original cloth. The little girl saw Ember first. She jumped up from the table and ran toward the horse, her thin arms reaching up. "Ember," she called, her voice bright as new silver. "You came back." Ember lowered her head, and the girl wrapped her arms around the horse's neck like she was hugging her best friend. The other children stood up slowly, hope and worry fighting in their faces. "Where's Papa?" the oldest boy asked, looking past Ember to the men on horseback behind her. Morrison dismounted, his legs stiff from the long ride. Up close, he could see how thin the children were. Thin like fence posts, like winter trees, like things that had been stretched too far for too long. Their clothes were clean but worn, and their eyes held a careful wariness that children shouldn't know. "What's your name, son?" Morrison asked the oldest boy. "Samuel Kane," the boy said, standing straighter. "This is John and Thomas and Mary." He pointed to each child in turn. "Are you the sheriff?" Morrison nodded, feeling the weight of his badge like it was made of lead instead of tin. "I am." "Did you find our papa?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Morrison looked at the 4 faces watching him, at the empty table, at the way Mary was still hugging Ember's neck like the horse was the only solid thing in her world. "Can we talk inside?" Morrison said finally. The cabin was even smaller inside than it looked from outside. 1 room with a stone fireplace, a few pieces of handmade furniture, and a loft where the children must sleep. Morrison could see everything at once. The empty shelves, the thin blankets, the pot hanging over the fire with nothing in it but water. On the mantel above the fireplace was a photograph of a woman with gentle eyes and a soft smile. Martha Kane. Beside it was a small wooden cross and a dried flower tied with a yellow ribbon. "Papa said he'd be back by supper," Mary said, still holding on to Ember's bridle. The horse had followed them inside, which should have been strange, but somehow wasn't. "He said he was going to get us food." Morrison sat down on a wooden chair that creaked under his weight. The children gathered around him, waiting. Samuel's jaw was set hard, like he was ready for bad news, but hoping for good. The younger boys held hands, and Mary pressed close to Ember's warm side. "Your papa won't be coming home," Morrison said, the words coming out rough and honest. "He's got to be with your mama now." The silence that followed was the kind that felt heavy, like the air before a storm. Mary started to cry, quiet little sounds that seemed too small for such big sadness. Samuel put his arms around his brothers, and they all held each other while the truth settled over them like dust. Morrison looked around the cabin again, searching for signs of Kane's stolen money. But all he saw were empty spaces and careful poverty. A few dishes, clean but chipped. Clothes hanging on pegs, mended and remended. A Bible with pages soft from use. No wealth, no hidden wealth. No sign that Thomas Kane had been anything more than a desperate father trying to keep his children alive. Outside, the sun was starting to sink toward the horizon, painting the desert rocks red and gold. Morrison stood in the doorway, watching the light change, feeling the weight of his badge and his choices and the 4 pairs of eyes that were watching him decide their fate. Behind him, he could hear Mary whispering to Ember, telling the horse secrets that only children and animals understood. The ride back to Millfield was quiet as a funeral procession. Morrison had left Tom Briggs at the cabin with the Kane children while he and the other men returned to town. Samuel had asked to stay with his brothers and sister, and something in the boy's voice told Morrison that separating them now would be like tearing pieces from the same cloth. Ember followed behind Morrison's horse without needing to be led, her hooves keeping steady time on the hard ground. Every few steps, Morrison would turn in his saddle to look at her, and every time he did, those dark eyes seemed to ask him the same question. What happens now? The sun was setting when they reached Millfield's main street. Word had already spread about the posse's return, and people were gathering on the sidewalks, their faces eager for news. Morrison could see Mr. Carlyle standing outside his bank, his white mustache bristling with righteous anger. "Sheriff Morrison," Carlyle called out, stepping into the street. "Did you find my money? Did you find Kane's hideout?" Morrison dismounted and tied his horse to the post outside the jail. Behind him, Jake Reeves and Charlie Morgan were doing the same, but they kept their eyes down like they didn't want to be part of whatever came next. "We found Kane's place," Morrison said, loud enough for everyone to hear. And Carlyle's voice carried the expectation of justice, served and wrongs made right. Morrison looked at the faces gathered around him. These were good people, mostly. People who worked hard for what they had and didn't take kindly to theft. They deserved the truth, but Morrison wasn't sure they'd like what the truth looked like. "We found 4 children," Morrison said. "Kane's children. Alone in a one-room cabin with nothing but empty shelves and an empty table." The crowd stirred, murmurs passing between neighbors like wind through wheat. Mrs. Patterson, who ran the general store, put her hand to her throat. Pete Jameson took off his hat and turned it over in his hands. "What about my money?" Carlyle demanded, his face red as a rooster's comb. "Gone," Morrison said simply. "Spent on food and medicine, near as I can tell. Then we'll get it from the sale of his property. That cabin, his horse, whatever else he had." Carlyle gestured toward Ember, who was standing patient as stone beside Morrison's horse. "Mr. Carlyle," Morrison said, his voice getting that edge it took on when his patience was wearing thin, "that man's property wouldn't cover $10 of what he took. And those children don't have anywhere else to go." "That's not the bank's problem," Carlyle said, straightening his vest. "They can go to the county orphanage. It's what happens to children who don't have family." Morrison had been to the county orphanage once, delivering a boy whose parents had died in a wagon accident. The place was run by a man named Hutchins who believed that hard work and harder discipline could beat the wildness out of any child. Morrison had seen the bruises on some of the children there, seen the way they flinched when adults raised their voices. "Those children have been through enough," Morrison said. "The law is the law, Sheriff. Kane was a thief, and thieves get punished. If he's dead, then his debts fall to his estate, which includes those children." Morrison felt something hot and angry rising in his chest. "Those children are 6, 8, 10, and 14 years old. They never stole anything from anybody, but their father did, and now they have to live with the consequences." The crowd was getting restless. Morrison could hear people talking in low voices, some agreeing with Carlyle, others shaking their heads. Mrs. Patterson stepped forward, her face soft with worry. "Sheriff, what will happen to them?" she asked. "They'll go where they belong," Carlyle said before Morrison could answer. "To the orphanage." I'll send word to Mr. Hutchins first thing tomorrow. Morrison thought about Mary Kane, barely 6 years old, trying to comfort a horse that was bigger than she was. He thought about Samuel, standing straight and tall when he introduced his brothers and sister, taking on responsibilities that should have belonged to grown men. He thought about the empty table where 4 children had been waiting for a father who would never come home. And then he thought about his own daughter. Elizabeth Morrison had been 7 years old when the fever took her. 7 years old with yellow hair and eyes like morning sky and a laugh that could make even the worst days feel lighter. She'd been gone for 5 years now, buried in the little cemetery behind the church, and not a day passed that Morrison didn't think about her voice calling Papa when he came home from work. Mary Kane had the same yellow hair, the same bright eyes, the same way of looking at the world like it was full of possibilities instead of dangers. I need to go back out there, Morrison said suddenly. Check on Deputy Briggs and make sure everything's secure. There's nothing more to secure, Carlyle said. Just bring those children back with you. The sooner they're out of that cabin, the sooner we can sell it to recover what we can. Morrison mounted his horse without answering. Behind him, Ember fell into step, following him out of town as the last light faded from the western sky. The ride back to Kane's cabin gave Morrison time to think. Time to remember. Time to feel the weight of the badge on his chest and wonder if wearing it made him a better man or just a man who followed orders. When he reached the cabin, he could see lamplight glowing warm and yellow in the windows. Tom Briggs met him at the door, his young face troubled. "Sheriff, I've been talking to the oldest boy, Samuel. He told me some things you need to hear." Inside, the children were gathered around the fireplace. Someone had found food somewhere. Morrison suspected Briggs had shared his own rations, and the children looked less hollow than they had earlier. Mary was sitting on the floor next to Ember, who had somehow squeezed herself partway through the cabin door so she could keep the little girl company. "Samuel," Morrison said, sitting down on the same creaky chair he'd used before. "Deputy Briggs says you have something to tell me." The boy nodded, his face serious beyond his years. "It's about Mama, and why Papa did what he did." Samuel's voice was steady as he told Morrison about the fever that had taken Martha Kane. How it had started with just a cough, then gotten worse and worse until she couldn't get out of bed. How his father had sold everything they owned to pay for medicine, then borrowed money he couldn't repay, then finally begged for credit at every store in 3 counties. The doctor said there was medicine that might help, Samuel said, but it cost more money than Papa had ever seen. He sold our cow, our chickens, even Mama's wedding ring. But it wasn't enough. Did the medicine help? Morrison asked, though he already knew the answer. For a while. She got better for maybe 2 weeks. We thought. Samuel's voice cracked like ice in spring. We thought she was going to be all right. But then the fever came back worse than before. Morrison looked at the photograph on the mantel, at Martha Kane's gentle face. When did she die? February. Right after the big snow. Samuel wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. Papa never got over it. Said he'd made her a promise to take care of us, and he meant to keep it no matter what. That's why he robbed the bank. Morrison asked. We hadn't eaten in 2 days, Samuel said simply. Mary was getting sick, and little Thomas couldn't stop crying from hunger. Papa said he'd rather be a thief than let us starve. Morrison felt something heavy settling in his stomach. Around him, the cabin was quiet except for the crackling of the fire and the soft sound of Mary humming to herself as she stroked Ember's neck. Outside, night had fallen complete and dark. Stars were coming out one by one, bright pinpricks in the black sky. Morrison stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the vast emptiness of the desert. Behind him, he could hear the children getting ready for sleep. Samuel helping the younger boys climb the ladder to the loft. Mary asking if Ember could stay inside all night. Tom Briggs quietly adding wood to the fire. Morrison thought about his duty as sheriff, about upholding the law and serving justice and doing what the town expected him to do. He thought about Mr. Carlyle and the orphanage and children with bruises who flinched at loud voices. And he thought about Elizabeth, his little girl who would have been 12 years old now if the fever hadn't taken her. Elizabeth, who had loved horses and yellow ribbons and stories about brave knights who saved people in trouble. When Morrison turned around, Mary was looking at him with those bright eyes that reminded him so much of his daughter it made his chest ache. "Are you going to take us away?" she asked, her small voice barely louder than the fire. Morrison knelt down, so he was eye level with her. "Would you like to come stay with me and my wife for a while? Just until we figure out what's best for you and your brothers?" Mary's face lit up like sunrise. "Could Ember come too?" Morrison looked at the horse, still standing half in and half out of the cabin door, still watching over the children like a four-legged guardian angel. "I think Ember's already made that decision for herself," Morrison said. As he spoke the words, Morrison felt something shift inside his chest. Something that had been heavy for a long time getting lighter. Something that had been broken starting to heal. Tomorrow, he would have to face Mr. Carlisle in the town and all the questions about law and justice and doing what was right. But tonight, he was going to take 4 orphaned children and 1 loyal horse home to his wife, Martha, who had been wanting to fill their empty house with young voices for longer than either of them cared to admit. The badger's chest didn't feel quite so heavy anymore. The morning sun was painting the desert gold when Morrison rode back into Millfield with 4 children and 1 red horse following behind him. He'd spent the night thinking about what he would tell the town. Truth was a tricky thing. Sometimes it needed to be whole. Sometimes it needed to be shaped like clay to fit the spaces where it was needed most. Morrison had decided on a truth that would protect what needed protecting and satisfy what needed satisfying. Mr. Carlisle was waiting on the steps of his bank, same as Morrison had expected. The man's face was tight with the kind of anger that came from a sleepless night spent calculating losses. "Sheriff Morrison," Carlisle called out, his voice carrying across the quiet street. "I trust you're bringing me good news about my money." Morrison dismounted and walked over to where a small crowd was already gathering. Behind him, the Kane children stayed close to their horses, Samuel holding Mary's hand while the 2 middle boys pressed close to his sides. Ember stood beside them like a guardian, her ears alert but her stance calm. "I'm afraid the money's gone, Mr. Carlisle," Morrison said, his voice carrying the weight of finality. "Kane buried it somewhere out in the desert before he died. Could be anywhere in 1,000 square miles of empty country." Carlisle's mustache twitched. "Did you search? Did you look for landmarks, disturbed ground?" "We looked. Found nothing but rocks and sand and wind." Morrison met the banker's eyes steadily. "That money could be scattered from here to Mexico by now, for all we know." It wasn't entirely a lie. The money was gone, spent on medicine and food and the desperate hope of keeping a family together. It might as well have blown away on the desert wind for all the good it could do anyone now. Mrs. Patterson stepped forward, her kind face creased with concern. "What about the children, Sheriff? Those poor little ones can't just stand in the street." Morrison had been waiting for this question. "My wife and I have talked it over. We're going to take them in for a while, until we can figure out what's best for them." "The orphanage is what's best for them," Carlisle said, but his voice had lost some of its earlier fire. "It's where children without families belong." "They have a family now," Morrison said quietly. "They have us." The crowd stirred at this, murmurs passing between neighbors like ripples on water. Morrison could see surprise on some faces, approval on others. Mrs. Patterson smiled and nodded. Pete Jameson took off his hat in a gesture of respect. "This is highly irregular," Carlisle protested. "Those children are connected to a crime. Taking them in could be seen as," he searched for the right words, "as harboring the family of a criminal." "Thomas Kane is dead," Morrison said, his voice getting that edge again. "These children never committed any crime except being born to a man who loved them enough to make a terrible choice." Behind Morrison, Mary took a small step forward. Her yellow hair caught the morning light, and her voice was clear and sweet as a church bell when she spoke. "Please, mister," she said to Carlisle, "we don't want to go to the scary place. We want to stay with the sheriff and his nice wife." Morrison saw something change in Carlisle's face. The banker looked down at Mary, then at her brothers standing close together, then at Ember, who was watching the whole scene with those dark, knowing eyes. "Well," Carlisle said finally, clearing his throat, "I suppose if the sheriff is willing to take responsibility. I am, Morrison said. Then I suppose that settles the matter. Carlyle straightened his vest and turned back toward his bank, though I still think the whole situation is highly irregular. As the crowd began to disperse, Morrison helped the children down from their horses and gathered their few belongings. They didn't have much, some clothes tied up in a blanket, a few precious items from their cabin, and the photograph of their mother that Samuel carried like it was made of gold. The Morrison house sat at the end of Main Street, a white clapboard home with a wide porch and a garden where Martha grew vegetables and flowers in neat, careful rows. It wasn't a big house, but it always felt too empty with just two people rattling around inside it. Martha Morrison met them at the front gate, wiping her hands on her apron. She was a small woman with graying hair and eyes the color of summer sky, and when she saw the children, her whole face lit up like Christmas morning. "Oh my," she said softly. "Oh my goodness. Look at you all." Mary let go of Samuel's hand and walked straight up to Martha, looking up at her with those bright, trusting eyes. "Are you the sheriff's wife?" Mary asked. "I am indeed. And you must be Mary. Your papa told people in town about his little girl with hair like sunshine." Martha knelt down and opened her arms, and Mary walked right into them like she'd been doing it all her life. Over Mary's head, Martha looked at Morrison with tears in her eyes and nodded once, firm and sure. "Come inside, all of you," Martha said, standing up but keeping Mary's small hand in hers. "I've got fresh bread in the oven and soup on the stove. You must be hungry from your long night." The house smelled like home, bread and coffee and the lavender soap Martha made from flowers at her garden. The children stood in the front hallway, uncertain and overwhelmed, until Martha started talking in her gentle way about where they could put their things and where they would sleep. "Samuel, you can have the little room off the kitchen. It's got a good window for morning light. And you younger boys can share the big room upstairs. Mary, there's a lovely room next to mine and the sheriff's, with yellow curtains and a view of the garden." "What about Ember?" Mary asked, looking back toward the front door where they'd left the horse standing in the yard. Morrison smiled. "Ember can have the stall next to my horse, Buck. I think they'll get along just fine." That first day set the pattern for all the days that followed. Martha bustled around the kitchen, making sure everyone had enough to eat, while Morrison showed Samuel how to tend the horses and fix things around the property. The middle boys, John and little Thomas, quickly discovered the creek behind the house where they could catch frogs and skip stones. And Mary followed Martha everywhere, chattering like a magpie and asking questions about everything from why bread rose to where babies came from. Her laughter filled the house in ways Morrison hadn't heard since Elizabeth had been alive. Ember settled into Morrison's stable like she'd always lived there. She seemed to understand that her job now was different. Instead of carrying a desperate man through the desert, she was watching over children who played in the yard and needed something steady and reliable in their world. The weeks passed into months, and slowly, the sharp edges of grief began to soften for everyone. Samuel learned to work the small ranch, his young hands growing calloused and strong. He never complained about the hard work, never asked for anything except the chance to help provide for his family. Morrison taught him to read brands and judge horseflesh and fix a fence so it would hold against wind and weather. John and little Thomas started attending the schoolhouse in town, walking there each morning with their lunch pails and slate boards. They were quick learners, hungry for knowledge the way they'd once been hungry for food. The schoolmarm, Miss Porter, told Martha they were two of the brightest students she'd ever taught. Mary became Martha's shadow and helper, learning to cook and sew and tend the garden. Her laughter rang out across the property like music, and more than once Morrison caught Martha just standing still to listen to it, a soft smile on her face. The town gradually forgot about the missing bank money. There were new scandals to talk about, new problems to solve, new lives to live. Mr. Carlyle hired a new clerk to replace his son Jimmy, who had decided to try his luck in California. The bank kept running, money kept flowing, and life kept moving forward the way it always did. Sometimes, when Morrison was working late in his office, people would stop by to talk about the Kane children, how well they were doing in school. How helpful Samuel was becoming around town. How Mary's smile could brighten even the grayest days. "You did a good thing, Sheriff," Mrs. Patterson told him one evening as she was locking up her store. "Taking those children in. It's what their parents would have wanted." Morrison just nodded and tipped his hat, but inside, he felt the warmth that came from knowing he'd chosen right when choosing had mattered most. On quiet evenings, when the work was done and supper was finished and the dishes were cleaned, Morrison would sit on his front porch and watch the children play in the yard. Samuel would be teaching his brothers how to rope fence posts. Mary would be braiding flowers into Ember's mane, while the horse stood patient as stone. Martha would come out and sit beside him, her hand finding his in the way it had for 23 years of marriage. They'd watch their new family, because that's what they were now, family in every way that mattered, and Morrison would think about the strange paths that led people to where they needed to be. Thomas Kane had died believing he was a failure, a thief, a man who'd broken his promises. But maybe, Morrison thought, Kane had succeeded in ways he'd never imagined. Maybe keeping his children alive long enough for someone else to love them was the greatest victory a father could ask for. The sun would set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of red and gold that reminded Morrison of Ember's coat. Stars would come out one by one, bright points of light in the darkness. And Morrison would sit there in the peaceful quiet, listening to children's laughter and his wife's gentle humming and the sound of a horse nickering softly in the stable. Some losses, Morrison had learned, were worth more than gold. And sometimes the law of the heart was the only law that truly mattered. In the distance, coyotes would call across the desert, their voices wild and lonesome. But here, in this circle of lamplight and love, there was no loneliness. Only the quiet satisfaction of a family made whole by the simple act of choosing kindness over duty, mercy over justice, and love over law. The badge on Morrison's chest caught the starlight, but it no longer felt heavy. It felt like what it had always been meant to be, not a burden, but a reminder that sometimes the greatest strength came from knowing when to be gentle, and the truest justice came from understanding that every heart, no matter how broken, deserved a chance to heal.